Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Ortega. I hope you had a wonderful long 2-week spring break and are ready to get back to class. Unfortunately, it has to be online, but nevertheless, we are here. We're going to continue to learn about plants. Yes, plants. We were here in chapter 13 last time we left off, and that's where we will continue. So we were looking at plant structure and growth, and we'll pick up on reproduction. And so let's scroll down to our slide where we left off here. We were going to begin the reproduction of flowering plants. Now this is something we've looked at before, so hopefully it's a little bit of review for you, but we will go ahead and look at this information here. Alright, so flowering plants. So let's start with the major organ, that is the flower. So the flower has floral organs. There are modified leaves. So the green leaves are at the base of the flower, are usually there to enclose and protect the flower bud. Those are called sepals. Moving along, those brightly colored petals that make up the flower are petals. They are colorful, they're fragrant. They're using their attributes to attract pollinators to come and get the pollen from the flower. The other portions are the reproductive portions of the flower. The male portion is the stamens, and the female portion is the carpel. And so the male portion of the stamens, as we have learned, consists of two parts, the filament and the anther. The anther contains the area, the sacs where pollen's made, and the filament props it up. The carpel is the female portion, and this has 3 subcomponents. There's a sticky stigma region at the top that will capture the pollen. Going through the style, then it's going to go to the ovary, which has 1 or more ovules depending on the flower type. And so here you can see that diagram. Hopefully you've become familiar with it already, but just in case you haven't, let's take a look here. Starting out at the bottom here, we have the sepals. They are those green leaves that are usually at the base of the flower to house and support the growing bud, the flower bud. Then you have the petals here, the brightly colored leaves that are going to attract pollinators. And then the pollinators will be responsible for getting the pollen to the stigma. So the pollen is located on the anther region of the stamen, and then the filament is there to prop that anther up, so that way the pollinators have access to it. And to get closer as well to the stigma, which is part of the carpel here. So stigma is a sticky region that pollen is going to attach, and then it's going to dig its way down through the style, eventually going to the ovary, which has 1 or more ovules. Inside that ovule will be an egg cell that will then fuse with the sperm from the pollen and form a new embryo. And so flowers themselves vary in color, size, shape, and so there are some examples here in this jar. And so the overall life cycle of the angiosperm, so remember the type of vascular plant that has flowers and fruits. The gymnosperms we learned last time have the cones, right? And so here, starting out with the flower structure is produced. Hopefully that egg will become fertilized and start developing a seed. That seed will then, along with the ovary, develop into a fruit. And so when that fruit is spread, eaten, dispersed, eventually that seed will hopefully land on a great area and start germinating or growing. And from there it's going to grow roots and then a shoot, and then grow into our normal sporophyte plant that we're familiar with. And so that's how the flower and the fruit correlate. So the flower structures, once fertilized, develop into a fruit. And so the process of fertilizing that egg cell in the ovule is very important, and we'll look at that in this chapter here. And so this shows you kind of the process as well. So here, mature plant on it has both the male and female portions that are needed. So the male pollen, the female has the ovary. Inside the ovary are one or more ovules. Inside each ovule is an embryo sac. And so when that fertilization takes place, then that will then develop into a seed. The ovule itself develops into the seed, and then the ovary develops into the fruit. And so once that fruit's dispersed, eventually that seed will hopefully land on a great area and start germinating. Germinating needs water presence. And so then it grows into the mature plant. Okay, so remember your plant life cycle. If you don't, this slide will review some of it for you. So all plants have the alternation of generations life cycle, where there is a haploid state and then a diploid state, and they take turns producing each other. So that going back to that previous slide, that normal plant body is called the sporophyte. This will produce spores. Spores will then produce gametophytes, and gametophytes will produce gametes. And so that portion in larger plants gets often muddled and confused. Well, I'll point it out to you, and I'll also point out what, to the extent of what you should know as well. And so looking at continuing that process, starting with the sporophyte, going to the gametophyte, those produce the gametes. The gametes are the egg and the sperm. And so that transfer, that pollen to the stigma, is a very important process for the flowering plants, and that is pollination. It's defined as a transfer of pollen from anther to stigma. And so here, let's take a look at that process. So this goes over the details of the sporophyte to spore to gametophyte to gamete. I'll point that out here. So this is your normal sporophyte, right? That's going to be the diploid state of your plant, and that will produce spores. And so that's what we see here inside that anther region. We're looking at the male gametophyte production of the pollen grain. And so the cell within that anther will Sorry about that. I do not know what happened, but here we are, hopefully back together again. Let's take a look. We were at understanding this diagram here with the male portion of the flower. So the male gametophyte is the pollen grain. And so that is inside the anther here. So if you look inside the anther, there are cells. Those cells undergo meiosis and produce spores. So this is the sporophyte producing spores. From there, there's a single spore that undergoes mitosis and makes a pollen grain. And so that will be now the gametophyte that will make the gamete. So the pollen grain is going to make this two sperm cells. And so in there you see the generative cell and the nucleus of the tube cell. These will eventually produce the sperm cells that we need. But for us, just know that that is where inside the pollen grain will be two sperm cells. And so the process is shown here. But all of this is very microscopic, as I've said, and hard to detect, especially without microscope slides. And so that's not something I would expect necessarily for you to remember all the little details here that are shown. But let's look now at the female aspect and the ovary. So looking at the male gametophyte, which is the embryo sac that will produce the egg. First, you want to start off with the ovary. The ovary contains one or more ovules. And so looking at one ovule here that undergoes meiosis. So this is sporophyte, going to produce a spore. So here you have a surviving haploid spore in the ovule. That undergoes mitosis to produce the embryo sac, which is the gametophyte that will produce the egg. So again, this is going from sporophyte to gametophyte, and between their spores and gametes. And so that is all still very microscopic, something that you won't notice unless you are looking for it. So again, big picture here, what do ovules contain? Eggs. What the ovaries contain? One or more ovules. Stick to the big ideas. Alright, so the actual pollination process is shown next. So the pollen grain released through the air has to land on the stigma. From there, those cells will generate what we call a pollen tube. That is just an open cavity that will help get those sperm to the ovule. And so here you can see the female portion, the embryo sac. Inside there's the egg cell, and then there's also the central cell, which is in purple here. And so moving down the style, then eventually it's going to reach the ovary, where it's going to go to one ovule. And so in that one ovule, one of those sperm will fuse with the egg and make the zygote. The other sperm will fuse with the central cell, and that will form the endosperm. This should have more about that here. And so the two sperm and the angiosperms are used, whereas in the gymnosperms, they each have two sperms in their pollen grain, except for the gymnosperms, one of those sperms will die, the other one will fuse with the egg. So this is much different here, that in the angiosperms, both of them are used. One will fuse with the egg, forming the zygote, and the other one fuses with the central cell. The two, which is already diploid, this 2N central cell will form a triploid nucleus, and then give rise to what we know as endosperm. So this is the nutrients that the new embryo will need. And so that process itself is called double fertilization, as there are two sperm fertilizing two different things. One the egg, one the central cell. And so here you can see that up close. So here's the pollen tube. Down the pollen tube, eventually the sperm will go through the micropyle, the opening on the ovule. And from there, one will fuse with the egg, which is usually right near that micropyle opening. The other one will go and fuse with the central cell, which is kind of the center region here, forming the endosperm. Just one moment, please. Okay, so we were here continuing our talk on the fertilization process. And so the zygote was the egg and the sperm coming together, and then the endosperm is the central cell and the sperm coming together. So let's continue on here. What are the two products of double fertilization? At this point, normally I get to ask you in class, but since that is not available, we'll just answer these on here, and then if you have questions, please let me know. So what are the two products of double fertilization? Well, the first one is obviously the embryo, the zygote, that when the egg has fused with the sperm. So that's the first one. And the second one will be the endosperm. So that's your central cell fusing with the second sperm. So those are the two products of double fertilization, the embryo and the endosperm. Okay, so now what happens, you may ask? After fertilization, that ovule will develop into a seed, as it has that growing embryo inside, and it's going to divide and become a larger embryo. And so as that develops, as the embryo gets larger and develops, the endosperm will develop, as that was once the centralized cell, now is going to start storing food for the embryo. In terms of the ovule itself, its integuments, the outer layers, are going to start forming a hard, resistant seed coat. And so that's what you see here, that ovule. The outer portions, remember, are integuments. That's integuments, integuments. Those are outer protective coverings. And so those will start to develop into a seed coat. The zygote will divide and grow into the embryo. So that's a fertilized egg cell, the zygote dividing and growing by mitosis into the embryo. And then the endosperm forming from your triploid central cell fertilization. So the endosperm here will house the nutrients for the growing embryo. You can see here has a root area, and that's nearest where that micropyle was, the opening, remember, in the where the sperm came through. Then you have the shoot region, the stem region, and then the cotyledons, the seeds. The leaves, the first true leaves. All right, and so what do different types, like the monocot versus eudicot, how do their seeds look, you may ask? And so here are some two examples. Those examples, starting with the common bean, this is a eudicot, so it has two cotyledons in its seed. And so those are shown here. For the bean, the cotyledons are actually going to also house the nutrients. So they're also, in a way, the endosperm. And they're very large, and they take up most of the space here on each part of this half. So it's kind of split in two halves. And then in the center here, the root forms nearest that opening where the fertilization had taken place. Then the embryonic shoot towards the top. And then the first true leaves, the foliage leaves, are here. All right, and so that's a common bean. Compare that to the corn, which is monocot. So it's going to have one cotyledon, one first true leaf, right there. And then surrounding that's the endosperm. This is what we saw in the lab experiment, where all this that's in blue right here stained the bluish black. And there's a tiny little white area that was towards the side. That was everything else that you see here. So that's the cotyledon, the embryonic shoot and root, and protective sheath covering that we'll see when it grows. That sheath covering will protect the embryonic shoot as it moves through the soil. And then you have the seed coat, and then the drying out of the ovary, which is the fruit tissue that's here. And so this is actually a fruit because there's a thin, dry ovary lining that classifies this as a fruit. All right, so what is the role of the endosperm in a seed, you may ask? The role of the endosperm is to provide the nutrients. As you know, growing plants require a lot of energy. That energy comes in the form of sugars. And other molecules like amino acids, proteins, lipids, all of that will be found in the endosperm. All right, so now that we've seen the seed development, we'll take a look at the fruit development. So the fruit is going to develop from the ovary. So the ovary has to grow, thicken, and mature into the fruit. So the fruit is defined as a mature ovary, and it acts as a vessel. It will house and protect the seeds and aid in dispersal from the parent plant. So the fruit is not only protecting the seed, but it's going to help move that seed further away from where the parent plant originated. And so here is a nice example of the pea plant. Remember Gregor Mendel and his pea plant studies led to the formation of the area of biology we know now as genetics. Here you can see the different aspects of the pea plants. So the nice stems and the bright foliage leaves and then growing stem here. And then the reproductive structure, their flowers. So the flowers, if you zoom in on those here, they have the nice brightly colored petals to attract the pollinators. Pollinators will want to move the pollen from these tiny little yellow things here. Those are the stamens to the stigma of the carpel right here. And once that's done, then the ovules will become seeds inside that ovary. And so here you can see the ovules. There are 5 in this example for that one carpel, one ovary. It's going to have 5 ovules. And when these are fertilized, they develop into seeds. So those are going to be the peas. And so now the ovary is going to develop into a nice thick protective structure that's going to be known as the pea pod. That's going to be a dried up, thickened ovary. And so that is a fruit, along with these fruits shown here. So here we have on the top the nice fleshy fruits that are going to be enticing animals to eat them and then disperse their seeds through the process of fecal elimination. So there are the apples, grapes, kiwis, oranges, plums, all of these, bananas are all examples of fruit. The fleshy fruit. Down here we have fruit that travels by wind. The maple fruits here, like the silver leaf maple, has seeds right there that are winged, so it allows for air dispersal. Whereas the dry fruits down here all have a ovary wall protecting the seeds that's dried out and has lost water. And so those are going to disperse through travel, usually through animals. Alright, so now I have a video on the fruit development, and I believe it should play the volume for you. So let's go ahead and do that.
The ovaries change their function and develop into seed-dispersing structures called fruits. There are many patterns of fruit development, depending on the number of carpels, ovaries, and flowers that form one fruit. Fruits can also be divided into the categories of dry fruits and fleshy fruits. In dry fruits, the ovary dries out at maturity. It may develop hooks that catch animal fur, as in this example. Or the ovary and other flower parts may form a wing or parasol or hairs to catch the wind. Sometimes the dry ovary builds tensions that, when released, will shoot the seeds into the air. In fleshy fruits such as tomatoes and peaches, the outer tissues of the ovary thicken and become soft, sweet, and brightly colored. Fleshy fruits invite animal dispersal. The seeds are ingested and, if they escape digestion, they are excreted with fertilizer, hopefully in a choice location.
Okay, so seed is to blank as blank is to ovary. And keep looking at our title here, the ovary develops into a fruit. So let's place fruit in that blank next to the ovary. So fruit is to ovary, as seed is to blank. So the ovary develops into a fruit. So what develops into a seed? And the answer to that would be ovule. So seed is to ovule as fruit is to ovary. Alright, so seed germination, how does that work, you may ask? And that will be what we look at now. A seed is going to be what we call an escape pod, where the embryo will first lie dormant. It's surrounded by a nice supply of food, the endosperm, and protected from the elements from using the seed coat. And so when it lands in a great environment, a moist environment where there is water, is going to absorb that water and expand. And that process is called germination. So it's going to germinate when it takes up water and expands and start growing. So it's going to absorb nutrients from the endosperm, and as the roots and the shoots emerges, it's going to start developing leaves. And so here for our common bean seed, we can look at its emergence and growth and germination. So here we have the seed. It has to absorb water and then start germinating or growing. And so it's forming the embryonic root first. Then the embryonic shoot will emerge in a U formation. And then from there, it's going to start emerging out of the ground. And then it's cotyledons. Its first leaves are emerging. Those cotyledons, those cotyledons will have that endosperm as well that will then emerge the first foliage leaves that you see here. And so now it's going to continue growing, and the roots will get deeper, the stem will get longer and taller, and these eventually will wither away. Compare that to our corn and monocot germination. This is going to have a protective sheath that's going to push upward, break through the soil, and then allow for the shoot tip to go through the sheath and allow for it to emerge without damage and easier. And then as well for this, the cotyledon will remain in the soil and eventually decompose. And so looking at that corn kernel here, it will absorb water, start germinating, start growing. It's going to first emerge a root and the shoot out one side. From there, the shoot region is going to have this gray sheath that will then go to the top surface. And from there, the green shoot will start growing through that sheath. As it grows through that sheath, then it's going to emerge some first leaves here. And looking at the rest of it, the embryonic roots will continue to grow deeper and branch out more. And the cotyledon, the first leaf there, that's what forms the shoot that eventually withers away, along with the rest of the seed components will eventually wither away. Alright, so which meristems provide additional cells for the early growth of a seedling after germination? And so that will require you to remember what type of meristems have we learned about, are generally studied. And so the meristems are the apical meristems, and there are the axillary or side bud meristems, along with meristematic tissue in the vascular and the cork cambium. And so the ones that provide the early growth after germination are going to be the ones that elongate the roots and the shoots. And so that's your primary growth, and that will be the apical root and the apical shoot meristem. So that's the key to that's the answer to this question. Which meristems? The apical meristems. Those are on the very ends of the root, the ends of the stem that will cause it to get longer. Whereas secondary growth is in that vascular and the cork cambium, and that will cause it to get thicker. Alright, so now we've covered the growth of the reproduction of flowering plants. Let's look at some asexual reproduction in plants. So asexual reproduction in plants produces what we call clones. Is essentially anything that's genetically identical to an organism or a group of organisms. And this is asexually produced for plants. And this can occur in two main ways. The first way is called fragmentation, where a fragment or a part of that parent plant develops into the whole plant. And so it makes a whole identical copy. And the second way asexual reproduction can occur is through the outgrowth of a root system of an existing plant. And so let's look at an example here. The first one on the top left, this is a garlic bulb. A garlic bulb can asexually reproduce through fragmentation. So splitting off a piece of the bulb will generate another clove of what we call clove of garlic. It will generate another, this is actually an elaborate stem region, and that will clutch onto its parent, but is genetically identical and is asexually reproduced by fragmentation. So that parent bulb in the center has fragmented off a piece that grows into a new bulb, and that is asexual reproduction by fragmentation. And so all these little cloves are genetically identical to the clove in the center, and the clove in the center is the parent plant. So the second type of asexual reproduction in plants is through the outgrowth of the root system. And the example here is our grove of aspen trees that you see. A grove of aspen trees here in this example could not reproduce sexually in that they were not successful in this region for several different reasons not known to our book example. But all of these have actually have grown through the outgrowth of root system. And so those root systems will spread far through the ground, and then some of them will go up towards the surface and start forming asexually a new plant. And so that's what happened. These plants here, so figuring this stuff out. All these plants are all going to be the offspring, genetically identical clones of a parent plant that will be somewhere in here, not determined from our picture. And so that's through the outgrowth of the roots. So the roots are growing up and they're forming new trees here in this case, and that are genetically identical to the parent plant, which I'm sure the scientists have estimated to be the oldest one there. And so that is the second type of asexual growth. And so you might even see that as you walk by some of the trees here in Texas, and especially in the dry heat of the summer, lots of the trees here will actually use their roots to grow tiny little stems and leaves on the surface around the parent tree to get more light and to get more nutrients for that plant as it's trying to survive dry conditions. So question here, which mode of reproduction, sexual or asexual, would generally be more advantageous in a location where the composition of the soil is constantly changing, and why? So this environment that they're giving us is a changing environment. So the soil matter is always changing, is going from different minerals to other minerals constantly. And so if you have plants reproducing, the sexual reproduction is going to be the one that generates genetic diversity. And so because of genetic diversity, they're going to have different gene versions and different abilities to sustain themselves in that soil. And so that would be the best bet in terms of survival because it's in a constantly changing environment. If it was in a static or stationary environment, then the asexual reproduction would be more beneficial to spread that plant. All right, so next up here is how does this apply to agriculture, you may ask. Lots of farmers will use science when determining their crops and which strains of the crops are going to grow. So this provides many opportunities for the farmers to generate large number of plants, a large number of crops, and that's very beneficial. But it can also be detrimental in ways that if something were to change the environment, let's say a pest, an insect, to completely destroy that one crop. It's going to spread quickly as they're all genetically identical. They're all going to fall to the same problem the original one had. But it can also have lots of benefits for reproducing asexually, as in large plant crop size. You can also use cuttings of plant tissue to grow more plants, so you're not even having to spend as much on seeds for your crop. So there are lots of different aspects to consider for a large production scale using asexual reproduction. I can also look at other scientific tools. So here you can see the first one is grafting on the left. Grafting is a way of adding either two strains of one species together or two species together, forming a hybrid plant. And so it can be done either way. I believe this example is of one species of two different strains coming together to introduce that genetic diversity in a unique way. And then this one here is a plant clone that's done in the lab. And so that's all through artificial means. So why would it be advantageous to graft one strain of wine grape to another? The answer to that is not so clear, in that these are two different strains of assuming one species, that they're going to have different versions of those genes. And so that might cause the roots of the grape plant to grow better, or the stems to grow better, or larger, bigger, better grapes, sweeter grapes. They're all different types of genes, different variations that could occur. And so that's why it would be beneficial to have that variety, those options available in its DNA. All right. In terms of evolutionary connecting these adaptations of reproduction help some plants live very long lives. So the growth produced by the meristems and the protection provided by dense wood helps some trees live thousands of years. Like our example next, a bristlecone pine in California lives to be over 1,000 years old. And so this is also considered a living fossil, as it does not change very quickly, as its lifespan is still long. It takes a long time for this to evolve. And so that, along with this question here, why is the presence of meristems essential for the long life of many plants? Well, looking at meristems, they're going to be on the ends of the roots and the shoots, and so they are essential for growing that plant taller and the roots deeper. And so that's going to be key for a long life for plants. And so that here kind of summarizes the things that are in this chapter. And so here we have our "you're now should be able to's." You'll want to take a look at. And so with that said, I believe we've covered the rest of this chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know. I am here through many ways. If you have questions about this chapter, please post to the discussion board, comments on here, or comments on the class in Canvas. Otherwise, if you have questions about things particular to your grades or anything, please email me or comment or send me a message on Canvas. I'd be glad to answer anything.